Welcome to Revenge Report. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let's dive in. I'd been gone too long. Not in the literal sense. I'd only been on the outskirts, ignored in the shadows, but it felt like an eternity. The boardroom's polished table stretched out in front of me, gleaming under the cold overhead lights. Every seat taken except the one beside my father. He was seated 5 chairs down, looking every bit the aging titan of finance he'd become. But the bitterness in my gut was sharp enough to make the air around me thicken. The CFO had long since retired, yet his presence still haunted the industry like a ghost that couldn't move on. The meeting was typical of these high-level financial oversight affairs, dry, soul-sucking talk about cross-border anomalies, shell companies, and how fast money was moving in and out of some developing country I couldn't even find on a map when I was asked. But this time, the real puzzle wasn't just the money. It was the guy who'd been talking in that dialect, a language that wasn't even common anymore. I hadn't heard it in years. The regulator, a man from one of the smaller provinces in that same country, spoke the old trade slang, a language I'd learned before I could even drive. It wasn't supposed to be a part of this room. This was a room for white-collar suits, not dusty books or whispered street deals. No one blinked. No one responded. But I couldn't help it. The words tumbled out of me like a reflex, the way someone might answer a question without thinking, a part of me that I'd buried a long time ago. "It's not about the market, it's about the shift," I said, my voice casual. My father didn't look my way, but I could feel the air change, the sharpness of his stare, even from 5 seats away. The regulator's eyes locked onto mine, a small, reverent smile tugging at his lips. "She is the ledger," he muttered, his voice barely audible but enough for everyone in the room to catch the words. Silence fell, thick and heavy. Even the clock ticking on the wall seemed to pause. And then, my father froze. The room didn't change. No one else seemed to react, but my pulse hammered in my throat. That simple phrase, "she is the ledger," was the moment my father realized that all those years of silence, of pretending I didn't exist in his world of financial legends, were over. It was my turn to sit in the spotlight. The world at that table in the boardroom wasn't mine, but it had always been his. It was the life I grew up watching from the sidelines, pretending I didn't care. That wasn't true, though. I cared. I obsessed. I'd hide under blankets at night, reading economic textbooks when I should have been sleeping. I memorized cross-currency exchanges like they were poetry, deciphered market reports like they were puzzles, like I was trying to find some hidden pattern everyone else had missed. But I wasn't supposed to care. When I was a kid, Dad would walk into the living room, where I was hunched over the couch, scribbling numbers into notebooks. "Calculator tricks," he'd say, eyes barely flicking my way. "You'll never have the stomach for the real deals. Stick to something simpler." Mom would be in the kitchen then, sick but always patient with me. She'd smile quietly, her voice softer than it should have been for someone who was always tired. "Who understands markets understands war before it starts," she'd say. I didn't understand it back then, but I'd always repeat the words in my head, over and over like a chant. She didn't say much, but when she did, it was enough to keep me going. I spent the next few years in secret. Every time Dad went out, I'd crawl into the back of the closet, find the old textbooks he didn't even know I'd taken, and study. I taught myself everything I could about economic systems, shadow trading, audit protocols, anything I could get my hands on. In the afternoons, when Dad was at the office or playing golf, I'd sneak onto my computer and learn how to decode financial reports, market trends, those old foreign phrases he thought I'd never understand. I wasn't just learning. I was building something that felt like it would one day matter. By 14, I could hear the difference between a genuine investment and a cover-up. I could read a balance sheet in Spanish, French, and even some broken dialects from small corners of the world where real money moved in quiet shadows. I was fluent in the languages of finance long before I even knew what to do with them. Dad? He didn't notice. I wasn't even on his radar, except when I was in the way. His focus was always on the big picture, on him. So I stayed invisible, curled up in the spaces where no one paid attention to the fine print. That suited me fine. Until one day, when I was in college studying late, and the phone rang. I hadn't expected it, but there it was. Dad's voice on the other end, sharp and impatient. "Helena, I need a favor. Some overseas deal. They've got a lot of complicated numbers. I know you're good with that stuff." His words were flat, a request wrapped in a dismissal. A favor, like I wasn't already knee-deep in things I had no business knowing. but I couldn't help it. I leaned in, picking apart the lines of his questions. There was something off about the numbers he was asking about. Something wasn't adding up, but I couldn't exactly point it out to him, not like this. So I did what I always did. I decoded the mess, figured out what he was really asking. I knew the game, had known it for years. I'll look into it, I said, keeping my voice steady, like I hadn't just been given a rare chance to do something that mattered. For once, Dad would see what I could do, but it wasn't for him. It never was. A few years later, I was in the thick of it. No longer the girl in the shadows, but a forensic analyst with a regulatory body. My job wasn't glamorous. I spent hours hunched over reports, digging through numbers that told stories most people ignored. But I was good at it. I knew how to read between the lines, how to hear the gaps in the data where the truth was hiding. I trusted that, in the end, the numbers always told the story. They didn't lie. Then, one day, I came across a report that wasn't right. The data was skewed. Funding risks had been doctored, downplayed so someone could profit. A town's infrastructure had been labeled stable, when in reality, it was on the brink of collapse. I flagged it, corrected the record internally, and made sure it was noted. The numbers didn't lie, and neither would I. The next week, I heard the news. A facility in that very town, one that had been falsely deemed stable, collapsed. The death toll was high. Daniel was among them, my older brother, my best friend, the one who had always been the golden child of the family, the one Dad always praised, always relied on. My chest tightened as I read the news report, but I didn't need to see the details. I already knew what had happened. The risk had been underplayed, and now my brother was dead because of it. The same damn numbers I had flagged weeks earlier had failed him. I couldn't sit on it. I couldn't pretend this wasn't my responsibility too. So I submitted a formal memo. I pointed out the discrepancy, traced it back to the doctored records, and made sure the truth was there for anyone who bothered to read it. But I should have known better. The next morning, I got the call. My access was revoked. They'd taken me off the case, stripped me of any ability to report further. No explanation, just the abrupt ending of everything I'd worked for. But that wasn't the worst part. A few days later, I saw him, my father, on the news. He was giving a public statement about the incident, talking about the tragedy and the company's dedication to safety. His face was perfectly composed, but I could hear the edge in his voice when he said, "Helena exceeded her authority in this matter. She interfered with senior-level reports, and that led to the misinformation. It hit me like a slap. I wasn't even a name to him anymore, just a scapegoat. I'd always known he didn't care for me the way he did Daniel, but hearing him throw me under the bus like that, as if I was the reason my brother was dead, it broke something in me. I couldn't hold back the anger, the way he'd never really seen me, never really listened. I had been so focused on making him proud, but all I'd done was make myself a target. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about his reputation. So I did what I'd been avoiding for years. I cut him out completely. No calls, no visits, nothing. I never spoke to him again. It was easy to tell myself it was a decision based on principle, on what was right. But deep down, I knew it was also because, for once, I wasn't going to be the one to apologize. For once, I wasn't the one who had to swallow the silence. I didn't care what anyone thought when I moved into that tiny apartment. It was all mine. No one to answer to, no more corporate suits to impress. Just me, the faded walls, and the hum of the street below. I didn't have much, but I didn't need much anymore. The only thing I had left from my old life was the work I'd walked away from, and I'd buried that under layers of distance, like a wound I wasn't ready to let heal. I wasn't sure what to do with myself. No access, no voice in the conversations that mattered. But somehow, I found my way to a financial literacy center for refugees and immigrants. They were trying to give people a way into this country, a chance to navigate the mess of budgeting, taxes, and starting a business when you didn't even know where to begin. So I started teaching. Basic stuff mostly. How to fill out forms, how to read a paycheck, how to make sure you weren't getting ripped off by someone who knew how to play the system. It was simple, sure, but every class felt like a lifeline to someone. Every time I explained how a bank statement worked, how to make a budget that wouldn't get you in trouble, I could see it click in their eyes. I was giving them a piece of a world they'd never been taught to understand. It felt right, like I was doing something real again, not playing a game for someone else's profit. Then there was that boy. His name was Amir, maybe 16 or 17, and he'd been silent the whole class, his eyes constantly scanning the paper in front of him like the numbers on it were something too foreign to be understood. But finally, he raised his hand, a question I hadn't expected. Were you ever ballparked in the real economy? He asked, his accent thick but clear. I paused. What do you mean by real economy? The one where you make money, where you build something big, he said, looking down at his sheet like it was something too small to matter. I smiled and nodded, my heart a little heavy. Yeah, I said, keeping it simple. I did numbers in places most people won't ever see. His eyes widened like I had just told him something important. I didn't say anything more, but I didn't need to. He knew exactly what I meant. There were things you couldn't teach in a classroom, things you had to live through, things that burned you out and made you stronger at the same time. After that, I found myself coming back every week, showing up early, staying late. The classroom wasn't flashy, just a few tables shoved together, mismatched chairs, and a whiteboard that had seen better days. But every time someone learned how to write their name on a check, I felt a flicker of worth. Every time someone smiled because they finally understood how to file their taxes, it was like I was filling a hole I hadn't realized was there. I wasn't changing the world, but maybe I was changing someone's life. That was enough for me, for now. It was just after dinner when my phone rang. The number didn't look familiar, but it had that official vibe. Too polished, too clean. I almost didn't answer, but something told me not to ignore it. So I picked up. Helena, a deep voice said, smooth but clipped. This is Director Langston from the Economic Crimes Task Force. I'm sure you're familiar with the term nested liabilities. I froze. That phrase, it hit me like a sucker punch. Nested liabilities. I'd heard it before, back when I'd been in over my head with a classified case, a tangled mess of cross-border finance that had come close to exposing everything. But I had walked away from it all, buried the memory under more mundane things, like budgeting workshops and overdue rent. I didn't hesitate, though. The words slid out of me without thinking. Tangible risks breed latent costs. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a low chuckle, something approving in it. I thought you might still remember. We need someone who can hear the gaps in the numbers, Helena. We have an emergency meeting about some suspicious monetary signals crossing 3 nations. We believe there's a coordinated effort happening, but it's subtle, hidden behind legitimate transactions. We need someone who can see what others can't. My stomach tightened. The old pull was back, the need to dive in to untangle the mess before it got worse. But it wasn't about the work, not anymore. It wasn't about reclaiming some reputation I'd lost when I walked away. It was about making sure no one else ended up like Daniel. No one else ended up silenced by numbers that told the wrong story. I'll be there, I said, my voice steady, though the weight of it all already pressed against me. Langston didn't waste time with pleasantries. Good. We'll send a car for you. Be ready in 30 minutes. The line went dead, and I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, the room too quiet. I hadn't even realized how badly I'd been waiting for something like this, waiting for something to matter again. But this wasn't about me. It was about doing what was right for once. It was about fixing something, even if no one ever knew it was me doing the fixing. I took a deep breath and grabbed my coat, the weight of it feeling heavier than usual. It was time to step back into the world I'd left behind. But this time, I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I was doing it for him and for me. The building smelled like polished concrete and ambition, cold, sterile, like a place that could swallow you whole without even blinking. When I walked in, the buzz in the room was electric, charged with something urgent. Everyone was gathered around a massive conference table, leaning over laptops and papers, their voices low but tense. I didn't know what to expect, but I hadn't come here to play nice. I came to do the job. Langston was at the head of the table, but his attention was on the stack of documents in front of him. He nodded at me when I entered, but didn't speak. I'd been here before, in this type of room, only this time I wasn't an outsider. This time I was part of the team, sort of. I took a seat, tried not to let my hands shake. The transaction records they handed me were full of noise. Numbers, letters, codes, all designed to hide something. But it didn't take long to find the discrepancy. There it was, buried in the middle of a batch of seemingly innocent currency conversions. A single line, masked under a veil of legitimate transactions. I could feel the truth pulse through it. Something was off. It was too clean, too perfect. So perfect it had to be a cover. I leaned forward, my finger tracing the line. This, I said, tapping the paper, this isn't just a currency exchange. This is a coded directive. Someone is moving money, but the actual value is being disguised. The room fell silent. Every head turned toward me. I could feel their eyes, questioning, wondering if I was just seeing shadows in the data. But I knew. I could hear the lies in the numbers, the same way I'd always been able to. I stood up and pointed to the line. It's not about the transaction, it's about the phrasing. You'd recognize that phrasing, wouldn't you? You invented it. I didn't have to look at him to know he was there. I could feel my father's presence in the room, even though he sat at the far end, as far away from me as he could get. I didn't need to see his face. I could already picture it. The pale skin, the tight jaw, the way he pretended I didn't exist. He didn't respond, of course. He never did. The lead agent, a sharp woman with glasses that slid down her nose, turned her gaze between me and my father. She nodded slowly, her voice low but steady. "She's the ledger," she said, her words carrying weight. The room went completely still. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence stretched, and I felt the eyes of everyone around the table fall on me. But it wasn't the kind of silence that made you feel small. It was the kind that made everything else seem irrelevant. I was here, and I was doing this. My father, though, he didn't move, didn't flinch. His gaze never left the table. He just sat there, frozen, a man caught between the past and the present. His time pretending not to see me, pretending I didn't exist in his world, was over, and I wasn't backing down. I turned back to the rest of the room, meeting their eyes. This line, this isn't just money moving. This is part of a larger scheme. Someone's hiding something big, and they think no one will notice. The agents exchanged glances, clearly processing, but my eyes were still locked on my father. And I wondered for just a second if he was thinking about how he had always ignored me, how he'd always kept me at a distance, thinking he could bury the truth with his silence. Well, he couldn't anymore. The ledger didn't lie. Not anymore. And neither would I. The glow of my computer screen was the only light in the room. I'd stayed up all night combing through the records. The hum of the machine was the only sound, a constant reminder of the task ahead of me. I'd been through the data again and again, but I wasn't seeing what I needed to see. I needed to slow down. Focus. The building collapse, Daniel's death. They'd been a punch in the gut I hadn't expected. It didn't make sense, not when I had flagged the risk in the first place. But I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let it go. Not until I could prove the truth. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. How had my brother, of all people, been caught in the middle of a lie? I pulled up the records for the collapsed site again, the ones that had been marked low risk. Despite all the warning signs I had laid out, I'd flagged it before the tragedy, marked it as dangerous. It was there, clear as day in my original risk memo. I leaned in closer, scrolling through the versions, each one a little cleaner than the last. But then, there it was. A change. The memo I had submitted had been replaced with a sanitized version. Someone had overwritten my original findings. My warnings were gone. What I had clearly stated was now a vague, optimistic assessment. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, but I wasn't surprised. I knew who had done it. The digital signature on the override? His. I kept staring at the screen, feeling that familiar burn of betrayal. My father. He'd done this. He hadn't just approved the error. He'd rewritten my warning. He'd erased my voice, my work, to make sure the report looked clean. He'd done it for the merger, to protect his precious reputation. And in the process, he'd made sure that Daniel didn't stand a chance. I pulled up older internal communications from the task force, matching the phrasing from my original memo to the sanitized version. The same economic jargon, the same veiled language kept appearing. It was like a signature, a mark only someone who had been around long enough could recognize. He hadn't just made a mistake, he had made a choice. The choice to hide the truth, to protect a deal at the expense of my brother's life. The clean image, the deal he wanted, it all came at a cost, my brother's blood. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating. I was sitting there, alone in the dark, but somehow I wasn't by myself. I could feel him there with me, my father, his ghost, his legacy, sitting right next to me like he had all those years. The man who had never really seen me, never understood me, was now the one who had buried the truth so deep. I was the one who had to dig it back up. I didn't need to know more. The pieces were falling into place. The motive was clear. He had protected his career and his ego, and it cost us everything. It cost Daniel's life. I shut my eyes, squeezing them tight. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me, but I wouldn't walk away from it. I couldn't. I was done pretending it wasn't my fight. It never had been, and I wasn't going to let my brother's death be buried with the rest of the lies. I started drafting my report, the words clicking into place as I typed. My father's signature was on it, but it was mine now. I'd make sure everyone saw the truth for what it was. I walked into Langston's office, the file I'd put together clasped tightly in my hand. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a quiet decision that had already been made. I didn't need the world to know what I'd found. I just needed the right people to see it. Langston didn't look up when I entered, his focus on a stack of papers on his desk. The room was cool, sterile, the kind of place where people made decisions that shaped worlds. I set the file down on the corner of his desk, watching as his fingers moved to open it. He flipped through it slowly, no words, just the sound of pages turning. I didn't rush him, didn't need to. I knew what was in there, the truth, and it was more than enough. When he finally looked up, his face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp. "Do you want noise or impact?" he asked, the question heavy with meaning. I didn't have to think. "Impact," I said, my voice steady. I wasn't here for drama. I wasn't here to make a spectacle of it. I was here to make sure it ended. Quietly, cleanly, without the headlines, without the fanfare. Langston nodded like he'd expected the answer. "I'll get it started," he said. He didn't need to ask me any more questions. He knew what to do with what I had given him. It wasn't the first time he'd been handed something like this, and I wasn't the first to bring it to him. But the difference was, this time, the truth had teeth. Within days, the wheels were in motion. A sealed internal tribunal was convened. The investigation was quiet behind closed doors, with no cameras or microphones to capture the fallout. The focus was narrow, direct. No one needed to hear my voice in the halls of media. The truth would make its way through the right channels, and that was all that mattered. My father's name started disappearing from the financial boards, one position at a time. His pension privileges were quietly revoked, a footnote in some internal memo that no one outside the system would ever read. It wasn't a grand spectacle. It wasn't public disgrace. But it was enough. Enough to strip him of everything he'd built his life on, without ever having to say a word in defense. I was called to testify a few weeks later. The room was small, the kind of place where even the walls seemed to listen. I sat in the chair across from the panel, the weight of the room pressing down on me. They asked their questions, their eyes darting between the documents and me, but I didn't hesitate. I laid it all out. The false reports, the doctored numbers, how my warnings had been buried to protect a deal. And then, when I was done, I made sure they heard it. "My brother's name is Daniel," I said, my voice clear and steady, "and he's the reason I'm here." There were no gasps, no dramatic reactions. But I saw it. I saw the shift in their eyes. I saw the moment they understood the cost of the truth. And that was enough. I didn't expect headlines. I didn't need applause. I didn't even need to see my father's face. I needed history to be corrected, even if it was in the smallest, most subtle way. And I knew, when I left that room, that what I had done mattered. Not for me, not for recognition, but for Daniel, for the truth that had been buried beneath layers of lies. And when I left that room, I was done. The world didn't need to know my name. The numbers had already done their job. The ledger had already spoken. The moment the leak broke, everything changed. It didn't take long for the world to start picking at the edges, questioning every part of it. The headlines were predictable: scandal, betrayal, legacy ruined. People had questions. People had opinions. Did she ruin a man's legacy for revenge? They asked. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't need to. The noise came and went, but it didn't touch me anymore. The debate was as predictable as it was pointless. Some people tried to justify my father's actions, twisting it into a corporate game where I was the villain. Others tried to turn me into some kind of hero, like I'd saved the day. Both sides missed the point. But one message stood out in the noise. It was a short note, tucked quietly into my inbox. The subject line was simple: a mother's thanks. I almost didn't open it. But when I did, my heart skipped. "I don't know who you are or why you did what you did," it began. "But my son always said someone buried the risk." Now I know who. It hit me like a sucker punch. The woman didn't know me, but she knew what I had done. She understood the cost of the silence, just like I did. She understood the kind of price you paid for the truth. Her son had died too, and just like Daniel, someone had buried the risk. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. This wasn't just about me, I realized. It was about everyone who had been ignored, buried under the weight of someone else's mistakes. After that, more messages came in. Former auditors, people I'd never met, reached out, some with praise, others with questions. One message stood out: "I wish I had your courage." But with every message of support, there were a dozen more of hate. It didn't bother me the way it used to. The insults, the accusations, they were nothing but noise now. People could say what they wanted. It didn't change anything. I'd done what I had to do. The truth was out. That was enough. Then came the call. It was from my other brother, the one who had stayed out of all this, who had built his own life away from the mess we'd grown up in. "Mom would have been proud," he said, his voice thick, the way it always got when he was trying to say something important without saying too much. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The tears came, slow and heavy, slipping out before I could stop them. Mom would have been proud. I hadn't even realized how much I'd needed to hear that. All the noise, the hate, the praise, it didn't matter. But that one sentence from him was enough to make it real. I stayed on the line for a while, letting the silence settle between us, until I finally said, "I don't know what I'm doing anymore." "You're doing what needs to be done," he said simply. "Just don't forget who you're doing it for." After we hung up, I stared at the phone for a while, my mind still reeling. It was clear what came next. I needed to go back to the work that mattered, the work I knew would keep me grounded. I went back to teaching. The Financial Literacy Center, the interns, the students who didn't have a clue about the messes people like my father created, those were the people I could help. I taught them about ethics and fraud detection, about how to spot the signs of deception in a world where it could be hidden behind a spreadsheet or a slick smile. Every time I saw the light go on in someone's eyes when they finally got it, when they understood that the numbers told the truth, it reminded me of why I'd started this fight in the first place. It wasn't for the headlines or the revenge, or even for me. It was for them, the ones who would never let the truth be buried again. And maybe, just maybe, for Daniel. It was a rainy afternoon when he showed up. The kind of rain that makes everything feel gray and heavy, like the world is asking you to slow down. I didn't expect him. He wasn't the type to show up at my door. But there he was, a man who had worked with Daniel overseas, someone I didn't recognize at first. But I knew the moment he stepped inside. The look on his face gave him away. He was holding something small in his hand, wrapped in a crumpled napkin, his expression tight like he was about to say something he couldn't take back. He sat down without waiting for me to invite him, like he'd been here before, like he knew exactly where to put his hands, where to sit. "I was on the team with your brother," he said, his voice rough, like the words had been sitting in his throat for a while. "Before the collapse." I nodded. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. He'd come for something, and I wasn't about to rush him. He paused for a long moment, looking out the window, the rain streaking down the glass. Then he finally looked back at me, his hand shaking slightly as he pushed the small coin across the desk. I picked it up, feeling the rough edges of the worn metal beneath my fingers. It was a coin, but not just any coin. It had been scratched up, the kind of damage that comes from something being carried around for too long. "This is what Daniel kept with him," he said. "He always said if something went wrong, if he died, it wouldn't be from bad luck. It'd be from bad numbers." I turned the coin over in my hand, feeling the weight of it like it was too much for me to carry. On the other side was an engraving in Latin, Veritas Vincit. The truth prevails. The room went quiet again, and I didn't know what to say. The words felt too small. The truth had already taken so much from us, and yet it still demanded more. "I thought you should have this," he said quietly, standing up to leave. He always said someone would hear the numbers before it was too late. I didn't say anything as he walked out. I just sat there, staring at the coin. The truth, it seemed, never let you go. Later that night, I pulled out the framed earnings report Daniel had worked so hard on. I ran my fingers over the paper, remembering how he'd always said the numbers would tell the story if you just looked closely enough. I took a pen and wrote a few words on the edge of the report. "You went wrong the day you stopped checking the numbers." Then I folded it carefully, slipped it into a drawer. It felt like one of the last things I could do for him, one of the few things I had left to give. The next morning, I stood in front of my interns. I looked at them, knowing that they didn't understand yet, but they would. "In this room," I said, voice steady, "numbers aren't just data. They're warning shots, and we listen because silence is expensive." It wasn't much, but it was everything. And I knew that as long as I kept teaching, As long as I kept telling them to listen to the numbers, I wasn't alone anymore. The ledger never lies.